People came in such numbers, the farmer set up a hot dog and hot chocolate stand. And I was. This is not that particular bird, but I was up there a lot to take pictures. And I got to know the guy, and he pulled me aside one day and he said, I have a daughter in college. He said, this bird's coming back next year, right? And I had to break it to him. It headed back north that spring, and it probably spent the rest of its life up in northern Quebec somewhere. That's the way eruptive birds break our hearts. But that brings us to the first big question about bird migration, which is why on earth do they do it? And I think if you ask the average person on the street, they will tell you, well, obviously the birds are trying to get away from the cold, right? I do my birding on the East Coast. The peak of the shorebird migration is late August, early September. I can guarantee you those birds are not migrating because it's cold. You're out there on the tidal flats, surrounded by this corona of green-headed marsh flies and salt marsh mosquitoes marinating in your own sweat. It's 96 degrees with a 98% humidity level. It is not the cold driving those birds south. As the Godwit shows, it's not hunger. They're migrating at their fattest. Frankly, birds can take the worst weather that this planet can throw at them. I mean, how many of you saw the March of the Penguins, right? But you're right, emperor penguins breeding in the depths of the Antarctic winter. Birds are not afraid of cold. It's not the cold that drives these birds south. It's what the cold brings with it. It's how the cold changes the environment. And a great place to understand this at a really visceral level is Cape Churchill in Manitoba, up on the shores of Hudson Bay. Many of you have probably been to Cape Churchill in the summertime. It's one of those must-visit bucket list places for birders. 120 species of breeding birds, including Ross's gulls, other species you can see almost nowhere else. And come fall, almost every one of those birds is out of there. Because in wintertime in Cape Churchill, nature makes a serious attempt to try to kill you. The temperature drops down to 70 below zero. The sun barely comes above the horizon. There's polar bears everywhere. If you're a little Wilson's warbler, get out of Dodge. But you can learn a lot about migration by looking at the birds that don't migrate, like willow ptarmigan, one of 24 species of birds that spend the whole year in Cape Churchill. This is what a willow ptarmigan looks like in the summertime. Mottled buff and brown and black and white camouflaging mix. But come winter, they molt into an almost completely white plumage. They grow extremely long, dense feathers on their feet that, not for insulation, but to act as snowshoes so they don't fall through the snow. And they have a digestive trick that's the reverse of what the godwit does. Instead of their guts getting shorter, their intestines actually grow by 30 to 50% because they've got nothing to eat all winter except the buds of those little dwarf willows and dwarf birches that you see in the background there, which has got to rank as the dullest, blandest diet in the bird world. Now, I got to tell you, if it were 40 below zero and that's what I had to eat, I would migrate. But migration is dangerous. You don't know where you're going if you're migrating for the first time. Storms may sweep you from the sky. Predators may pick you off. You may suffer exhaustion and calamity. You may get where you're going and discover that, hey, look at California's having an epic drought, or the mountainside that I was planning on wintering in has been destroyed. It's, what's this Walmart thing? If you don't have to migrate, don't. And the willow ptarmigan, because it's so well adapted to a subarctic environment, doesn't have to. The reason a yellow-headed blackbird leaves its marsh here in Montana is not because it gets cold. It's because it gets cold and the ice has sealed off that marsh and sealed off the aquatic insects and seeds and all the other things that yellow-headed blackbird needs to survive. Migration is not about cold. Migration is primarily about food. When you look at a black-burnian warbler born in the forests of North America, this is an insect-eating bird. There are just simply not enough insects in the forests of the northern hemisphere in the wintertime for the billions of insect-eating birds that are here in the summertime. There are insects here. That's why we have chickadees and kinglets and creepers that make it through, the harshest Montana winter. But the groups of birds that are most highly migratory are the ones that depend on seasonally available food supplies, like insects or fruit or nectar, or else on seasonally available habitat, like open water. If you're a duck or a goose and you stick around until it freezes, you are literally a sitting duck out there for a coyote unless you migrate south. So that tells you why this Blackburnian warbler leaves the forests of Michigan and heads south, but it does not tell you why that Blackburnian warbler flies all the way to the foothills of the Andes. I mean, if it wants bugs, there are bugs in Biloxi. There are bugs in Pascagoula. You don't have to go to Bolivia for the winter, for God's sake. That's an incredibly hazardous migration. And this has puzzled ornithologists for centuries, frankly. And the reason that we're so puzzled by this is because we think of these birds backwards. We think of these as northern birds that take this little short winter vacation south and then come back up here where they belong, right? Except that they spend the majority of their lives in the tropics. Think about the groups of birds: wood warblers, vireos, tanagers, flycatchers, hummingbirds, orioles. The list goes on and on. All of these are most diverse and most abundant in the tropics. These are tropical families of birds, which have colonized North America during these relatively brief interglacial periods when we don't have a mile-thick sheet of ice sitting on the northern part of this continent. And in a sense, their routes of migration every year retrace the routes of colonization that these birds have probably made many times. There's been 20 expansions and contractions of glacial ice in the last 4 million years. And each time the ice retreats, those birds come back up to take advantage of the long summer days and the abundant food that the northern hemisphere provides, and then they go back where they came from. Which brings us to the next big question, which is how on earth do they know where they're going? And I think if you ask the average person, they'd say, oh, that's Grandpa, right, up there in the front. The old wise elder leading the flock south, imparting the wisdom of the ages to them. And it's true that for waterfowl like these snow geese, for cranes like the sandhill cranes that we saw out at Lake Helena today, thank you very much, by the way, Janice and Joe, for your wonderful morning of birding. With those groups of birds, waterfowl and cranes, there is an intergenerational transmission of information. Young birds travel with older birds. They don't learn to migrate. Birds are born knowing to migrate. But they do learn specific routes and specific stopover sites, specific wintering areas, which is why you can lead young whooping cranes from Wisconsin to Florida behind an ultralight, teach them that route once, and they'll do that for the rest of their lives on their own. But every other bird comes out of the egg with a genetically coded set of instructions that tells them to fly in a certain direction at a certain time of the year for a certain length of time. They don't know where they're going. It's not a conscious decision. A Swainson's thrush doesn't get up one morning outside of Helena and go, I've heard that Central America's nice this time of year. They just have this. They just know they got to go, and they're traveling either by themselves or with others of their age. Mom and dad are not leading them south by the hand. It is entirely genetic. It is entirely instinctive, and it makes the whole thing entirely all that more amazing. And the trigger for it, as is the trigger for most things in nature, is daylight. Or more specifically, the changing ratio of daylight and darkness, it's called the photoperiod, as the seasons change. It causes hormonal changes in the bird's body that becomes this itch, that grows into this compulsion that just overwhelms them, this overwhelming urge to fly. And so these birds take off on their first migration in the fall. They leap up into the night sky just after sunset, this great exhalation of birds rising up. I mean, by the millions. You can see these things on weather radar. It's the most amazing thing on earth. And they fly up into the night sky, and they tap into spheres that you and I are blind, deaf, and dumb to in order to find their way south. We're just still peeling back the layers of the onion on how birds can orient and navigate across the landscape. We know that celestial orientation is incredibly important. Now, they're not doing this the way the ancient mariners do. They're not looking up at the pattern of the stars and saying, okay, the big W is Cassiopeia, so that means I make a left turn. It's not the pattern of the stars, but the movement of the stars. Yeah, go outside tonight if it's clear enough, and the moon's kind of bright tonight, but I want you to just sit out there and watch the stars until you see them move, right? Take a blanket with you. But the birds can see that, and they can see that the area around Polaris, the stars don't move, about 35 degrees on either side of Polaris. That's their cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. And if you raise them in a planetarium where they're under an artificial sky, they don't care what star everything rotates. You can make it, Betelgeuse and Orion, make it rotate around that. That's their north-south at that point. But of course, some nights it's cloudy. So they have a whole series of fallbacks. They can use magnetic orientation. When I was in college and took ornithology in the 1970s, we were taught that a lot of birds have a tiny little deposit of magnetic crystals called magnetite at the base of their nostrils. And the thought was it was like a little compass, kind of pulls their nose to the north. It's more wonderful than that. There is a visual component to it. These birds can see the Earth's magnetic field. You know what I would give to see the Earth's magnetic field? A house sparrow hopping around outside the colonial red lion can see feel humble about that. Birds can use extremely low frequency sound waves. So seabirds can navigate back across thousands of miles by a sense of smell. Leach's storm petrels will find their burrow on Baccalieu Island in Newfoundland among 4 million other Leach's storm petrel burrows in the dark by the way it smells. Birds are incredible. And they, in the process of doing this migration, they trade one world for another. In a matter of days, they leave behind everything they know and they go to an utterly alien environment and they fit perfectly into it. So that within a matter of a couple of days, a black-throated blue warbler born in the forests of Maine takes off and finds itself on the islands of the Greater Antilles or the coast of Central America. And suddenly, instead of moose and wolf and black bear, it's surrounded by venomous snakes and monkeys and macaws and all these exotic fruits and insects. And yet these birds, within moments of their arrival, recognize the alarm calls of resident non-migratory tropical birds because these are tropical birds coming back home again. They fit like a hand in a glove in these tropical environments. They are literally birds of two worlds. But there's an issue for them here because if you've ever looked at a map, you notice that there's a tremendous disparity in land area between North and South. Huge area up here in North America and very little in Middle America. And so for a species like the black-throated blue, which it doesn't have a particularly large range compared to a lot of North American passerines, but we're still talking about hundreds of thousands of square miles. And yet all of those birds fit basically in the wintertime into the 4 islands in the Greater Antilles and along the rim of the Gulf of Honduras in Central America. So the loss of a single acre of wintering habitat in the tropics, from a conservation perspective, may be as damaging as the loss of dozens or hundreds of acres of breeding habitat up here in the north. But wherever these birds go, people follow them. We have all done this. My name is Scott, and I'm a birder. Places, I'm curious, how many of you have been to High Island, Texas? Anybody in High Island, Texas? Okay, be honest, would you have gone to High Island if you weren't a birder? Not just no, but hell no. It's downwind of the refineries at Port Arthur on the Texas coast. Some days it smells even halfway decent. But High Island is a mecca for birders because every spring this is what happens. This is a Doppler radar image of the Gulf Coast. That's Texas and Louisiana, the Sabine Rivers, that big squiggly line up the middle. And this is not a thunderstorm. That's what a couple million songbirds looks like on Doppler weather radar. These are birds that took off the night before from the Yucatan Peninsula, have flown 600 miles nonstop north across the Gulf of Mexico, and they are not even tired. And I can say that because if they were tired, they'd be stopping along the Gulf edge. But they're flying hundreds of miles further inland to get to the big bottomland swamp forests that are like the Colonial Red Lion Hotel of bird migration, a big 5-star hotel for these birds. But they don't have weather radar. They don't know what's laying for it out in the Gulf. And about once a week during the spring migration, these birds take off from the Yucatan with the gentle south winds blowing them, ushering them across the Gulf, and they fly smack into a cold front with headwinds and hail and rain and lowering temperatures and dropping barometric pressure. And instead of a relatively easy 18 or 20-hour migration across the Gulf, it'll take them 25, 35, 40 hours to limp across the Gulf. And frankly, millions of them will not make it. They die anonymous deaths out in the Gulf every week. And that's been going on for hundreds of millennia. so that what make it across the Gulf are the best of the best of the best. And they fly into places like High Island in Texas, or Grand Island, Louisiana, or Dauphin Island, or Fort Morgan in Alabama, where this picture was taken. And they just come piling out of the sky. They are exhausted, they're on the ragged edge of starvation, and they need a rest. And this is the phenomenon called fallout. And if you have never experienced a Gulf Coast fallout, that needs to be on your bucket list. Where the woods will be utterly and completely empty. And then about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Gulf Express arrives, and these birds just come pouring out of the sky. And you've got black-throated green warblers sitting on the brim of your hat, eating the mosquitoes that are coming in to bite you. You've got Swainson's warblers so exhausted you can pick them up off the sand of the beach, and you can walk along the beach and see the birds that made it 599 3/4 of miles and didn't make it that last quarter mile and are washing up on the beaches. That Gulf Coast rim, that thin rim of maritime forest along the Gulf Coast, is arguably the most important migratory link in this hemispheric migratory chain in all of the Western Hemisphere. Virtually every bird that breeds east of the Rockies passes up through that area every year. I spent many, many years going down to the Gulf Coast in Alabama every spring to work with the Hummingbird Study Group, studying this trans-Gulf migration. And we would set up our mist nets. We would ban birds like the Swainson's warbler, interrupt their lives for a few minutes, put a leg band on them, weigh them, measure them, let them go, and then in the days ahead, recapture a lot of those birds and see how quickly they were regaining weight, how quickly they were putting on fat. And one of the things that we and other researchers along the coast have found is that the land that's protected along this incredibly rapidly developed stretch of coastline, the best protected land is of the least use to these birds. It's mostly seashore and pine forest. And what these birds need are dense thickets of hackberry and oak, the kind of place covered with greenbrier that any good self-respecting Alabamian or Mississippian is going to look at and say, it looks like there ought to be snakes in there. We ought to clean that up. And so, what happens in one spot makes an enormous difference for birds that fan out, as I said, across half the world's surface. We did that work for many, many years for a lot of reasons. We did it because it's exciting. We did it because it's an incredible privilege to work directly with these birds. We did it because it gave us an opportunity to educate the people that came to Fort Morgan State Park by the hundreds every day, but mostly we did it because we're scared. Because the populations of so many migratory birds are in steep decline. You can look at radar images, archived weather radar images, not Doppler, but the old-fashioned kind, all the way back to the 1950s, and see that the frequency of these big trans-Gulf migrations, like I showed you a picture of a minute ago, have declined by 50 to 75% in the last 40 years. If you think there are fewer birds today than when you started birding, it is not your imagination. There's a lot of reasons for that, and these declines to this point have been much more profound among eastern forest songbirds than western forest songbirds. And there's a lot of reasons for that. For a long time we assumed that the biggest problem was down in the tropics, that loss of that single acre of tropical habitat that I talked about. But for species like wood thrushes, and for many forest interior species that evolved to nest deep in the interiors of large, intact, contiguous forests, there's very little of that kind of habitat left. Once upon a time, most of eastern North America was a huge, solid blanket of forest. My home state of Pennsylvania, where Steve's from, it's 70% forest, but it is not an unbroken blanket. The farthest you can get from a road, power line, utility corridor, or gas pipeline in Pennsylvania is about 3/4 of a mile. It is a fragmented blanket, and the fragmentation brings in edge predators like blue jays, crows, skunks, possums, raccoons, house cats. It brings in brood parasites like brown-headed cowbirds, and it has an impact on these birds. We need to do everything we can. I mean, migration is hard enough already. We've got, on top of all of these natural threats that these birds face during migration, storms and wind and parasites and disease and predators, and just stretching the limits of avian physiology. To that now we've added speeding cars and agrochemicals and lighted skyscrapers and wind turbines and habitat destruction and house cats, and just goes, the list goes on and on. But there's a lot we can do. There's a lot that Montana Audubon is doing for migratory birds. don't get Steve going on some of this stuff, because he is the best ambassador for birds. But Montana Audubon's working with a lot of iconic species here, species of water birds, birds like white pelicans. White pelicans that winter in Mexico. One of the places that's near and dear to both Steve's heart and mine is Veracruz in eastern Mexico, the site of the world's largest hawk migration, 4.5 million migratory raptors a year. Steve was instrumental in getting that hawk migration count started back in the early 90s, and in the fall of 1992, I spent 6 weeks down there helping the first major count. What blew us away were the number of white pelicans we saw. We knew we were going to see a lot of hawks, but we would see these, 5,000 or 6,000 white pelicans a day coming down from the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains, heading south. Well, there's only, 4 nesting sites, 4 colonies of white pelicans nesting in Montana. This is a bird of significant conservation concern, and one that Montana Audubon has been working with to try to preserve. Franklin's gulls, another just incredible migrant. Unfortunately, most people, when they see this, say, oh, it's a seagull. Well, the last time I looked, we're a long way from the sea here. And this is a tern-like gull. It's a highly insectivorous gull, and it has an incredible migration route. They breed in the Great Plains and the Northern Rockies. Montana is an important state in terms of having conservation stewardship responsibility for Franklin gulls. But these birds, when they head south, go all the way to the southern coast of South America. They spend the winter along the coast of Chile and Ecuador. They actually go south through the Great Plains. They go down the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and then they cross over the Isthmus of Tehuantepec into the Pacific coast, and then head south from there. Just absolutely astonishing. So the next time you're out at Lake Helena and you see the Franklin gulls go by, a little bit more respect for the seagull, please. You heard earlier about a little bit about the work that Montana Audubon is doing with golden eagles, and this is another bird that's very near and dear to my heart, because we of course have an eastern golden eagle population that comes out of the subarctic of eastern Canada. But golden eagles across the west are in decline, and we don't really know why. It's probably a host of factors. Montana Audubon is instrumental in doing statewide golden eagle nest surveys to try to get a sense of where all the nesting pairs of golden eagles are, and of course has been monitoring golden eagle migration in the Bridger Mountains for 24 years now. The biggest golden eagle migration in the world, I have to admit that, even though I grew up in Hawk Mountain. But we don't have basic information. If we don't have basic data, we don't know how to save these birds. And as you heard, there are more and more threats coming to bear on these birds. One of my favorite birds, a bird that is a red letter day anytime I get to see one, are long-billed curlews. And this is a bird that used to be an eastern bird. Their breeding range is predominantly western now, but they used to winter all across the southeast. In fact, there are breeding records of these birds from South Carolina and Georgia, but that population disappeared in the late 17 or early 1800s. This is a bird that winters primarily along the Gulf and Pacific coasts, and especially in Mexico. And I had an opportunity a couple of years ago, well, probably about 10 years ago now, to visit a place called La Soledad in northern Mexico. It's an enormous area of prairie dogs, the largest remaining prairie dog town anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And it is an incredibly important wintering area for long-billed curlews. I saw a flock of 6,000 long-billed curlews. I about died and went to heaven. It was, and ferruginous hawks and burrowing owls. A lot of the birds from Montana are heading down to those parts of northern Mexico to spend the winter. And so the work that Montana Audubon is doing with long-billed curlew is incredibly important for preserving that. And the weirdest bird, with hands down the most mysterious bird in North America, is another one that Montana Audubon's been working hard with. This is the black swift. This was the last bird that North American breeding species where we had really no firm clue where it spent the winter. And it's such a mysterious bird at every step of the way. And they only breed, behind waterfalls, nests of moss in the dark dark. They lay a single egg. The chick is in the nest for 50 days. It's ridiculously long nestling period, and then they would just disappear. We assumed to South America. Nobody was really quite sure. But a couple of years ago, in 2010, scientists in Colorado put geolocators on a handful of black swifts. They got 4 of those geolocators back the next year, and it turns out these birds are traveling all the way to the lowland rainforest of Brazil, which South America wasn't a surprise. Lowland rainforests were, because these are birds that like topography. They like cliffs and waterfalls where they can cling and roost. There's nothing like that in the lowland rainforest of Brazil. But it may be that they don't stop when they're in Brazil. 2 years ago, scientists in Europe put geolocators with tiny little accelerometers on alpine swifts in Europe and let them go, and they flew down to Africa for the winter, and they came back, and then they downloaded the data, and they found out, based on the accelerometers, which was supposed to tell them when the birds were sleeping and when the birds were flying, was that the birds never stopped flying. That during their entire 7 months in Africa, they fly continuously. They feed and sleep on the wing. And there's some suspicion that black swifts may be doing the same thing. This, in fact, may be typical for swifts. We don't know. Birds do amazing things. The big enchilada for migratory bird conservation, the thing that I think keeps more bird conservationists awake at night than anything else, is climate change. When you think about bird migration, you think about how delicately balanced everything is. Bird migration is balanced on physiology and weather and prevailing winds and seasonally abundant food supplies. And if you perturb any elements of that, the whole edifice comes crashing down. And that's what we're starting to see with climate change. Climate change is inevitably going to perturb that system. Now, we've seen that some species of birds are arriving weeks earlier in the spring than they did 30 or 40 years ago, and they're leaving weeks later in the fall than they did. And that's good, right? There's some plasticity there. But when you look at the birds that are showing that adaptability, they're all short-distance migrant birds. They're mostly species that winter within North America, mostly north of the Mexican border, who can judge, based on immediate weather patterns, whether is it unusually warm this year, in which case I'll catch the south wind and fly back to Montana a couple weeks earlier, or there's a lot of north wind coming, I'm going to hold back and wait until the weather changes. The birds that are flying the longest distances, the neotropical migrants coming up from South and Central America, are, on average, arriving to the day when they did a century ago. Their timetable has not changed, but everything else has. And what's happening is that these birds are getting farther and farther and farther out of sync with the rest of nature. And we haven't seen this yet, what I'm about to describe, in North America, but we probably will in the relatively near future. But in Europe, some species of Palearctic migrant birds, birds that winter in Africa, have gotten so far out of sync with the natural systems on which they depend that their populations are collapsing. The pied flycatcher, which was one of the most common birds in the deciduous forests of Europe, it's declined by more than 90% in the last 15 years because these birds, and many of our birds do the same thing, time their migration so they arrive in the northern hemisphere so that they can set up a territory, find a mate, build a nest, lay their eggs, hatch those eggs. The babies emerge just at the time when the leaves have come out of the trees and the caterpillar flush is at its greatest, because